Good evening. Is it on? Good. I'm so thrilled to be back at Wayne Community College. As Ms. Wilkins, I mean Barbara, it's still very hard for me to call someone by their first name when I've been marrying them my whole life, said. I grew up in Goldsboro. And as a high school senior, I took my first art history class here. Ms. Turlington, my professor, was a woman who dared to be different, much like our subject today, Gertrude Stein. I'm so grateful that the Jump Start program existed. It really opened my eyes in a way that I needed. Rather than stomping moodily around Eastern Wayne High School, I saw what life could be like in college after graduation. I participated in a caliber of learning here that only comes from being surrounded by college students. Ms. Turlington, for instance, never repeated an assignment more than twice, and that was a useful habit that I now employ with my own students. Her art history class was, I'll be honest, selected mainly because it got me off campus the earliest on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. But it set me on a course that would determine the rest of my life. I was lucky enough to return and to teach at Wayne Community for a semester after finishing my graduate degree. I'm grateful to my friends who were willing to play pretend games long after we were too old for them. They would oblige me and reenact whatever book we just read. They were equally happy as we got older for me to be the soccer team manager or the swim team manager, since it became apparent that I was not going to be on the soccer team or on the swim team. I'm especially grateful to my parents, Marianne and Jim Parker, who so many of you know. They indulged my quirky habits. They never once told me that it was weird to spend a rainy afternoon digging in boxes in the attic, or that I should stop pulling up my grandmother's carpets, that there were no secret passageways for me to discover. That sort of thing always happened in books, so I was sure it should happen to me. My dad introduced me to auctions. When I was very small, he would drive me to Bobby Langston's in Wilson, and we would browse the sales. I had so much fun watching and listening. I had no idea I was getting math lessons as the auctioneer worked through the increments, or history lessons as the auctioneer, for instance, would describe a gorgeous chair made on the South Carolina coast circa 1820, and how the stylized rice plants on the back tell us where it came from, and how the carving into the strats here and there, and et cetera, et cetera. I just thought it was a fun afternoon with Dad, and afterwards we'd go to the dairy bar. When I began reading Harriet the Spy as a very young girl, I got my own notebook and I began sneaking around Pill Hill. Surely surveillance would end better for me than it did for Harriet, wouldn't it? And my mom was just delighted that I wasn't in the attic any longer. And in fact, no. I was lucky that it was Margaret Bedour who caught me in her azaleas. Rather than hand me over to my mother, though, Ms. Bedour gave me a job, and I fed her cats for quite a few years while she was away. I'm also grateful for Stage Struck. The theater gave me a place to excel in a very different place from my peers. Acting, of course, was fantastic. Since a lot of you have known me since I was very small, you know that I love the limelight. However, also in Stage Struck, I learned stage makeup, how to turn a pimply old teenager into an old crone, or how to transform a kid into a fairy using little more than pastel-colored rayon and glitter. I learned about costuming and the importance of a well-run archive. I think most importantly, though, I met other students and other adults, many of whom were nothing like my teachers or my parents or even my friends' parents. They were actors. They were fast-talking, and they were black-clad, and they were utterly fascinating. Stage Struck especially really opened my eyes. So today we'll be discussing Gertrude Stein, and this lecture is part of a series that I've done of Women with Vision, where I talk about female collectors who really invested in artists and changed the course of art. So we'll be looking at a seminal work of Cubism, the Three Ladies of Avignon, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, made by Pablo Picasso in 1907. And this canvas is enormous. It's 96 by 92 inches, so taller than I am and wider, almost a full square. And it's hung in MoMA on one wall, and it really smacks you in the face when you walk into the room. And even though it was painted 110 years ago, it's still really fresh and exciting and controversial. But that being said, the first time I saw it, I didn't like it at all. And I wonder how many people in here don't like it either, right? A show of hands? It's okay, you're not being graded on it. Cubism was one of the first movements to look like art that a preschooler does. However, rather than dismissing it out of hand, I'd really like us to unpack that assumption today. So this phase of Cubism was called analytic Cubism, and it was intended to be thought-provoking. It was intended to be difficult and something discussed with friends and haggled over and argued over. It was not supposed to be pretty. The Cubists really sought to supersede reality and to create something beyond cloy art that was merely superficial and appealing. This was the generation that followed the Impressionists. So when we're thinking about Picasso, the previous generation of artists would have been Monet and Cézanne. So there are a couple of different components that fed into the rise of Cubism, and one of these were non-academic influences. So African masks, Chinese scrolls, and even autodidacts whose scribbles resembled, you guessed it, figure painting by toddlers. And another point that the artists were trying to make was that simplicity could be deceptive. So for instance, Mondrian, who is a Dutch artist, painted really simple shapes, squares, rectangles, in primary colors. Right? It looks incredibly easy. However, he was free painting all of these crisp geometric shapes. And can I see a show of hands for people who've ever had to paint the trim in their bathroom? And you probably laid down tape, right? And then you peeled the tape away to make those crisp, clean lines. Mondrian didn't tape his canvas. He was such a perfectionist that he found a way to use oil paints to create these crisp, clean lines. And so one of the points that he and that other artists like him make is that abstracted works can be deceptive in their simplicity. And if you still feel like anyone could paint that, consider the rise of photography as high art. That became an interesting problem for artists because as technology made it easier and easier to create and replicate reality, artists began to wonder, why should I spend a lifetime trying to master the skills it takes to replicate reality when a camera can do it for me in a matter of minutes? So for the first time since antiquity, the canvas was no longer a window onto an alternate reality. It became an entry into another world. And another problem came with the Industrial Revolution, and that the de-skilling of art is something that scholars talk about, and that the replacement of skilled laborers by technology. And this is an argument that sounds familiar anywhere that manufacturing jobs have been lost. And so just as we value manual labor along with skilled labor, so we should value different kinds of artwork too. And that the artists who create this use different techniques. They use collaboration, exploration of new materials, radical thought, and effective execution of new ideas. And if, in fact, you are still not convinced, if you still think that a toddler could have painted this, and if this art makes you angry or irritated, then even that's a great reaction, because at least you'll leave here thinking about it tonight and talking about it. And anything really is preferable to apathy. And so I'd like to get started with the section that will deal with Gertrude Stein. So she was an independent woman with total faith in her own taste. And really what made Paris magnetic for vanguard Americans in the early part of the 20th century was the same thing that brought Gertrude Stein there. She was an American who'd grown up in Oakland, California. And she came to Paris to find a place to be herself and a place really to be different. She supported the artist, and she supported all of the artists she collected, but particularly Picasso in his very early years with material, financial, and even emotional support. So here, for instance, we see her sitting in front of her portrait that Picasso painted of her. And she sat for this portrait over 90 times. Picasso painted it at her home. And it surely didn't take him 90 tries to get the portrait right. He was an excellent artist and could have painted it much more quickly. But as anyone who's ever had a boss knows, the more face time you have in front of that boss, the better it will go for you. And that was surely what he was tapping into. And so this transition point in his career was really when Stein's support was the most critical. These works of art are not created in a vacuum, for instance, so the patron could have a real impact on the finished product. And she got involved, and so here is an image of her living room. So you see here is her portrait, and then we'll see a couple of these others. Keep your eyes peeled. We're going to see this painting later, and even this one, which is quite a bit washed out. And then even some of these early or late Cézanne and Renoirs, that, like I talked about, were from the previous generation. So one of the reasons that I'd like to address why I'm talking about Gertrude Stein was that she really bucked the expectations for well-born women, and that art collecting was well and good, but that she was committed. She wasn't a dilettante. She was not buying pictures to match her sofa. She was in fact buying pictures instead of buying furniture, instead of buying clothes. She wore the same rough brown robe almost every day. She was a natural leader at her time and was called plenty of names reserved for nasty women at that time, and likely still would be so today. And she was a major influencer with artists, introducing Picasso to all sorts of her friends, particularly other rich Americans who were visiting Paris and who were hungry for a taste of the avant-garde. And because of the strict social constraints that she was brought up with, she felt much freer, surrounded by the counterculture, surrounded by artists and other creatives. The impact of her taste continues to influence us today. So one thing I'd like to talk about is what was going on at the same time. What was Picasso pushing against, right? He was part of the avant-garde, and that's a name that borrows itself from the military for the people who take the most risk, who go headlong into the line of fire. And John Singer Sargent was an artist who was very much a part of the Academy, of what were the accepted trends in art at the time. This portrait was painted in the 1880s, but Sargent continued working and was a contemporary of Picasso's. And Carnation, Lily and Rose is a beautiful portrait. It is engaging, it's appealing, it's something that anyone would love to live with. And that it's a very different thing from the Three Ladies of Avignon. And when you think that the way that the avant-garde artists were really pushing against the norms. Remember that, again, one of their chief aims was to create something that would not become a trophy for the rich. And the easiest way to do that was to make it visually unappealing. And so, which a lot of people will agree, Picasso succeeded. And so in pushing against this academic standard, he really did go on to create something new and something different. But his work was so different that his dealer at the time refused to buy any of his paintings. He had a hard time selling Picasso's work at all in his blue period and his rose period, when he was still painting, people with their noses where they were supposed to be, and their eyes in the right spot on their face. And then when Picasso gave him Cubism, something totally different, his dealer, Bernheim Jean, said, absolutely not. There's no way I can take these pictures. But Gertrude Stein did. She bought all of his Cubist works. She gave him, she essentially wrote checks for his rent to make sure that he could have somewhere to live, have food to eat, in order to be able to continue creating his art. And so a patron's role is really evidenced by the way that the Western canon has evolved, and the split that followed the Salon of 1863, when artists kind of began to deviate from what was expected of them in the Academy. And when Gertrude Stein moved to Paris, she moved there to be there with her brother Leo, who was much better. He was older than her. He was much better educated, and he really wasn't interested in Cubism. He was buying plenty of risque art. He bought Matisse, he bought Braque, but he wasn't interested in Picasso's version of Cubism. But Gertrude was not the trained connoisseur that her brother Leo was. In fact, her taste was personal and it was arbitrary. And her debut really in New York with literature coincided with the 1913 Armory Show, which is something that we'll talk about shortly. As a collector, Stein was chiefly influential from about 1903 to 1914. She was a supporter of Picasso, Matisse, Gris, and Braque. And so these were two of the early works that she bought in 1905, which were incredibly just shocking for the time. But that once she bought them, hung them up in her apartment, that her apartment essentially became the first de facto museum for modern art. No dealer was willing to take them, no gallery was willing to show them, so people started coming to her apartment, flocking there really to get to see it. And so this is Picasso's portrait of his dealer, Ambrose Vollard, and it's a very small drawing, only about 20 by 13 inches, but for anyone who's not sure if Picasso could actually draw, here we have a wonderful example that yes, in fact, he was a gifted draftsman. He chose to follow a different path. And so here is an image of what Stein's apartment would have looked like with some of the images that we talked about earlier. And Vollard, Picasso's dealer, who also was friendly with the Steins, gave them an enormous compliment. She said that the Steins bought paintings not because they were rich, but rather they bought art despite the fact that they were not. That their $8,000 windfall would have spoiled them if it were kept one year when they got an unexpected chunk of money in the mail. And so they spent the $8,000 on art. So we mentioned the Armory Show in 1913, and this was an exhibition that was held in New York City, and it really gave Americans hungry for a taste of the avant-garde. Their first sampling. A lot of this art came directly from Gertrude Stein's collection and from the artists that she handpicked, that she pointed the curators to. She and Picasso both had complete confidence in their own abilities, and in such a way that even when we talk about her literary debut, it's her writings are thought of by critics as not having the sort of firm foundation that they should, but still she went ahead, she wrote and wrote, she published plenty of books. And Picasso felt the same way about his own work. His mother told him that if he was a soldier, he would become a general. If he was a priest, he would become the Pope. But Picasso said, I am a painter, and so I became Picasso. And Stein quite quickly circumvented the dealers with their percentages and eventually began buying directly from him. She even brokered deals with wealthy Americans who were visiting in Paris and hoping for a brush with the avant-garde. And for example, the Cohn sisters, who have a connection to North Carolina through Greensboro. And the Cohns went ahead and moved to Baltimore and eventually established the Baltimore Museum of Art. Baltimore has an extraordinary collection of Picasso's works, particularly Picasso drawings, because when they visited New York, or when they visited Paris in 1911, Gertrude Stein took them to his studio, and they were so thrilled by what they saw there, they were scooping drawings up off the floor. Picasso was pulling them out of the wastebasket and selling them to them. He couldn't believe his good luck. But so as you can see from the Armory Show, Cubism was pretty widely reviled. This cartoon is from 1913. It looks like something that could have run today, and that the Cubist exhibit, started a riot. That these are you can't quite read the labels. This one says Velasquez and Rembrandt and Reynolds and Halls. So these are all of the old masters. All of them, running out of the Armory Show, just shocked by the way that the world has turned topsy-turvy. And so back to our picture that we continue to discuss. So we've talked about a lot of the ways that Picasso departed from tradition, but let's examine a few of the ways that he stuck to what he did learn at the Academy, because he graduated at the age of 15 from university in Madrid. And so one of the things that we should talk about is the coloration that he used. He still used really traditional colors. That skin is still roughly a skin tone, hair is black, that there's a red curtain framing the image here, and that it contrasts with the cool blues and whites in the background. So this helps us identify what we're looking at. and that he's laid down a ground of colors that, that is the same way he would have been taught to create richness and depth to colors. And we'll see an example of underpainting from a Vermeer from the 16th century, which is again the same way that artists had been doing it for centuries. And the subject is a classically accepted subject. These are, it's a series of female nudes arranged into a triangle, arranged into one large triangle on the square canvas to give it a sense of balance. But then you see even smaller triangles where this woman highlights her face in a triangle, where again there's another triangle of these three women sitting separately. And then even the still life here is in its own triangle. And so, speaking of the still life, this is when you get to hold up your hands. And if you make a triangle with your own hands and close one eye and you just look at the still life, it's yes, go ahead, you can do it. And then you see this really exquisite little image right here at the bottom of the page. But that Picasso is, and this is a classical device to embed a still life like this. He has played with perception and with space in a way that artists wouldn't usually do, because what you see when you hold up your hands like that is that the fruit basically falls off the page, right? It just goes really flat. There's no longer any depth at all. And that was by design. That was one of his little inside jokes. But it's a neat trick, and it's a fun thing to do in museums. If you ever walk around with your hand over your eye like that, people will think you really know what you're doing. And then also this embedding a still life into a large painting like this was again an academic trick. In academia, artists would have been assigned to a certain level of painting, and that the grand level were the massive history paintings, these huge canvases, these epic scenes, and that going down from that were landscapes, then portraits, and then getting down into still lifes and genre paintings, and that they were actually prescribed sizes for what artists could paint, for what subject could be what size, what artist could paint what. And then the Academy was not only where an artist learned to paint, but they also brokered the sales. That was the only way that an artist could sell their paintings, could essentially make a living being an artist. So that when these artists struck out against the Academy, when they broke away in 1863 and sort of started this push to become the avant-garde, they had no idea what they were doing. They had no idea if they would ever be successful. And they were taking enormous risk. So that when someone like Stein stepped in and said, "Yes, I will buy your art. I will even pay your rent," that it was a real coup for the artist of the avant-garde. So I talked about the underpainting, and this is a Vermeer from the 17th century. So we're going to look at a detail from right here in the carpet. Okay. So here we are. So you see how once you look at it really closely and under macrograph technology, this is what Vermeer was painting underneath. So that this underpainting was really also the underpinning, that it was the foundation for a really a good work of art. And that Vermeer, as all of the academically trained artists knew, that in order to create a rich blue, you didn't just use blue. To create blue, you would use orange even if you wanted to dull the hue. You would use red if you wanted to add richness. You could use these tiny dots of white that all blend together once you take it at a distance. And that this is how you come to create this wonderful tapestry here, which is really one of the stars of the painting, and that the reason that a carpet's on a table is because it's the most expensive item in the room, and that it was a sign of great wealth. So Vermeer took an enormous amount of effort when he did paint this carpet, and so the main reason that I want to be able to show you this detail is that Picasso, like I said, was tapping into his academic training. So we talked about his coloration, about the subject matter that he used, the way that he incorporated the still life, and that you too can look for tiny details in paintings. And then the red curtain that runs along the outside, which is again a reference to the canvas as a window, the canvas as a stage. And the way that one of the models here is holding back the red curtain and allowing a viewer a peek. So Gertrude Stein really stopped collecting around the time of the First World War. Cubism fell out of fashion, and also she became much more serious about her writing career. She was a teacher to the lost generation, and artists like Hemingway, Juna Barnes, Marsden Hartley, Mina Loy, who came to Paris. She sent Hemingway, for instance, to study the Cézannes at the Tuileries Museum for the principles of composition to utilize in his writing. She earned him to seek out the essential in language, which is, of course, what he proceeded to try and do for the rest of his writing life. She lent Hemingway 100 francs via mail in July 1927. After he returned from Pamplona, where he'd begun to work on The Sun Also Rises. And before World War I, she'd really been a pontiff to artists, to visual artists. But her apartment was really seen as an ode to Cubism, which became fairly outdated by the 1920s. Picasso, starting in the 1920s, took a new turn in his work. He began a neoclassical style. He started working with a chic society dealer named Paul Rosenberg. He moved to the Right Bank, which was a very swish neighborhood. He bought a new car. He had a chauffeur drive him around. And all of this because he started painting pictures that people wanted to buy. And so he finally had money in his pockets again. Stein was relatively broke. She could still afford to live a nice lifestyle in Paris, but she couldn't afford his new prices. And she resented that he would no longer sell her pictures at a discount. And Picasso's neoclassical style, like I said, sold exceptionally well. Gertrude surely resented the incursion of Rosenberg and couldn't afford his rising prices, so her attentions turned elsewhere, and she really began, like I said, collecting other younger artists and focusing on her own literary career and those of other writers around her. So there were, and other artists who she became interested in were people like Vasily Kandinsky, who were non-objective artists. And there is a difference in abstract versus non-objective painting. So non-objective painting is not supposed to look like anything. As Kandinsky titled his picture, Yellow, Red, Blue, here it's only supposed to be yellow, red, and blue. It's meant to appeal universally to everyone. My students are always telling me that, oh, I see a face, oh, I see a tank, oh, I see a car. But Kandinsky wanted it to be like looking at the clouds, that anyone could see whatever they wanted to see in his painting. And Picasso always stayed with abstracted painting, where he was painting a version of reality, but that it was distorted, it was abstracted. And so we can come now to some of the criticisms of Gertrude Stein. So other literary lions criticized her that she was not a real writer, that she was roundly criticized after her success with the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas in the 1930s, and that even though she had achieved success as a writer, it did cost her many friendships. She was fiercely competitive, for instance, and as she grew older, if another writer's status surpassed her own, the friendship generally cooled. If, for instance, you made the mistake of mentioning James Joyce twice, you were never invited back. And her taste was not infallible when it came to collecting. She championed Picasso in early years, but in later years, she often bought artists who weren't nearly as commercially successful. And in World War II, there remains an enormous question of how did a lesbian American supporter of degenerate artwork safely ride out the war in France. She did eventually leave Paris. She decamped to the countryside, to a small town, but she stayed in Vichy-controlled France, which essentially was still Nazi-controlled territory. And recent scholarship has shown her that she did have relationships with Pétain, who was the French governor for the Nazi-occupied sector. So to conclude with Gertrude Stein, her most important contribution really was as a collector of people. She was a lifelong expatriate. And she introduced two generations of avant-garde artists, the Cubist and then the lost generation of writers. She spoke appalling French despite spending her entire adult life in Paris. She lived openly in a lesbian relationship, and she bought paintings that no one else took a chance on. Stein really foresaw the great issues of our time. She yearned for a return to 18th century individualism and for the rugged 19th century pioneer spirit that had built America. In the face of the then emerging corporate mentality of the 1930s and 40s, she began to urge people not to forget the lessons of the Depression. And so to conclude, I wanted to quickly tell you a couple of stories of encounters that I had with artwork, some of which I really loved, some of which I really didn't, while I was working at Christie's, the auction house in New York. So while I was there, I was an account manager. I was not someone you would see on the Antiques Roadshow. I dealt with clients who, if you came in and you were selling your entire Aunt Lottie's house, you needed someone to deal with the rugs and the silver and 8 different specialists for all the paintings. And oh yes, there's a house in the south of France and an apartment in Miami, and we need to find out what it's all worth and what can we do with it. Those were the clients that I dealt with. So I handled really complex collections, and it was fascinating. It was never boring. This is an example of a sculpture that was sold at Christie's in April 2016 for about $500,000, and it was called the Sleeping Beauty. It was sculpted by Olivieri in the 16th century, and was a marble figure of Andromeda. And this was found hidden literally in a tower, wrapped in blankets. And had been there for 35 years. It was made for the Roman nobleman Mattei at the end of the 17th century, and the sculpture was perfectly preserved. And it had, despite the fact that it had been untraceable for over 260 years. There are records of it leading up to the 1770s. People would mention this in their travel diaries. Germans, Swedes, British coming to visit Italy would see this in Mattei's gardens and would write about what an incredible sculpture it was, but it had totally vanished. So when Christie's got the call, and when my colleague Will Russell finally was allowed to see the Andromeda, it was a really remarkable moment. And the most wonderful thing too is that this was described as appalling, as dreadful contemporary art by the Swedes, the British, the Italians even, who were looking at it at the time and who were writing in their travel journals about getting to see this sculpture, how it was lurid, it was lewd, it was awful, so I think it goes a long way towards saying that the art of the time can always be a bit shocking. But it's incredibly exciting, and the magnificent survival of this piece is worthwhile. And that once on another assignment, which I unfortunately don't have an image for, I found covered in dust a Chinese plaque. And this was not a glamorous assignment. We were in a house outside of Philadelphia, and my colleagues and I were frantically racing against the first freeze. We were in a house with no electricity, no running water, and the roof was about to collapse. My Girl Scout training had prepared me very well for this. I had a headlamp on, I had hot pockets in my gloves and my jeans and my shoes, but there was still a lot of great artwork inside, and we wanted to get as much out as we could. We moved slowly through each room in the unlit gloom, and we only listed about 200 lots a day, which is very slow. And so from behind a settee, covered in dust, we found this plaque that had fallen from the hook on the wall up above it. We brought it into Christie's. We couldn't tell if it was an imitation or if it was what we hoped it would be, which was a 16th century Chinese original. When the Chinese jade specialists looked at it, they decided they wanted to offer it in Hong Kong, which is a very good sign. It had a mate in the Chinese Imperial Museum in Beijing, again another very good sign, and it eventually fetched $500,000 US, which was again incredibly exciting. And I often worked with clients who had multiple homes. Some were Henrys, an acronym that means high net worth, not rich yet. And some were stratospherically wealthy. I took my first private helicopter ride when a client didn't want us to waste the 5 hours it would take getting through traffic and driving out to his beach house. So he said that the helicopter could pick us up on the top of the building and have us back by dinner time. And for this girl from Goldsboro, that was not just another day in the office. And I should say, too, that I didn't always love the art that I saw. I worked with one family that had an enormous doll collection. These weren't just any dolls. They were made in the early 20th century, hand-painted, down to every single little eyelash was individual, and porcelain heads made in northern France and Belgium. But every time I walked out of that room to get a drink of water, I felt like those dolls were following me. And there were 410 of them to work with. My last story from Christie's it involved when I got to shut down Fifth Avenue. We were working in an apartment on the 12th floor of a Fifth Avenue building. The apartment took up the entire floor, and the owner had been one of the original owners in the building. When they arrived in 1912, the furniture rode up in an elevator shaft that was much wider than the current elevator shaft a century later. And also, it was very likely that the furniture rode on top of the elevator car with someone standing there and holding it. That is not OSHA certified. So we could not get the furniture out through the elevator shaft, nor could it go down the stairways. We could get most things out, but there were some very big things. 2 full-size pianos, an enormous break front bookcase, and it was worthwhile to go ahead and get those out and sell them instead of just selling them with the apartment. So together with a huge team, including the shipper and insurers and attorneys and the building management and the administration of the great city of New York, we shut down 2 blocks of Fifth Avenue, got a crane, took off the casement windows, and sent the oversized lots out, where I held my breath and just prayed while I watched them being lowered onto a truck. And I was 8 months pregnant at the time as well. And that concludes my Christie's stories. But if you are interested in ever having an item appraised, Christie's does have an online appraisal service where you can have, I think it's up to 5 items appraised at no cost, and you simply email them the information. It's all on their website. Lots of other auction houses do that, but I prefer Christie's. And of course, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. And then that concludes my lecture.